Running commentary. We are exploring listening to albums. It is a lost art form. We took an hour out of our day. We switched off the phones. We switched off the computers. We did not answer the door. We sat down and we listened to the artist's vision and concept. The Prodigy. Music for the Jilted generation. The Prodigy. Music for the Jilted Generation was the second album by a British band, The Prodigy. It was released on XL Records in July 1994, Mute Records in the US, which is the same label as you know for Depeche Mode, although actually I believe they ended up on Elektra. But Liam Howlett is the lead performer for The Prodigy, and Maxim Reality is the co-writer and vocalist on Poison. And Neil McLennan is credited with the co-production and mixing. And then we have Pop Will Eat Itself, who are guest performers on the song Their Law. This was a #1 album in the UK and Finland, and the album achieved top 3 in France and New Zealand, with top 10 placings in Austria, Holland, Sweden, Switzerland, and Australia. It was recorded in Earthbound Studios in the Strong Room. The Prodigy had originated in Braintree in Essex. They have sold over 30 million records worldwide. They've won 2 Brit Awards for being the best British dance act. The band are named after the Moog Prodigy synthesizer. The band's first public performance was at the Four Aces in Dalston, which at that time was home to Club Labyrinth. So if we think of rave music, the #1 that we think of and the thing that comes to mind is drugs. And to my mind, that raises feelings of uncertainty about what I'm hearing. Was it made on drugs? Was it supposed to be listened to high? And that's not in a judgmental sort of old man out of touch way. That's more, it comes to a feeling of being on the other side of plate glass listening to music. It's almost like you need to smash the glass by taking a pill or a hit of something to get into the world that the doors are sort of closed on. Would it come alive to me if I were to take ecstasy? So, Alex, let's talk a little bit about the drug element of rave music. Now, obviously, at 13 years of age, I don't imagine you were popping a bunch of pills and getting off your tits to it. But the music is largely with Prodigy and Shaman and these kind of bands. If you think of that early rave scene, which dominated the early 90s and came from house music and techno, drugs definitely dominated that musical scene. So how much of that do you think was a part of this album?
Really, I don't think this album in particular, I think is, and it's documented in some ways as well, that predominantly the main thing behind this album was in I think it's the Public Order Act of 1994 at the time, which was the first time that the UK government pretty much criminalised what were a lot of the warehouse, maybe sort of like the more illegal raves, where it was quite commonplace for basically people would just meet up, generally in a motorway service station and things like that. It would just be a big group of cars would just travel down to a field somewhere. You wouldn't be told any locations. You would just literally follow down in convoy. It was all set up there to be a huge, huge sound system, speakers and things like that as well. And these parties would just go on for days, absolutely go on for days. And that was the core, and that's where obviously that rave culture come from massively. It was. Also, if I've done, obviously I was only 13 at the time, but I do think as well that's another time when it wasn't exactly an economically prosperous sort of time as well.
No, certainly not. I mean, we're definitely going through a recession, particularly in 91. It was a really sort of rough time. So, I mean, obviously the challenge here is, I would say that I wouldn't, like I said, I don't imagine that you were big, I mean, I know that you enjoyed raves later on in, you know, but it's interesting because when you're listening to this record as just listening to it as a piece of music, as opposed to being one of those kids or guys on the convoy or girls on the convoy, you do feel there's a detachment. You feel as though you're not quite in it cerebrally at times. At times, you know. After listening to it a few times, you definitely then start to connect with it. It starts to creep up on you. So the album starts with intro, which, as I've said, is a short intro piece, which says, "I've decided to take my work underground."
Yeah.
Right.
But that, again, that can tie back into the whole the criminalization of what was the rave scene back then. It almost gives sorry, it gives what it was with the rave scene back then. It almost gives a feeling of like the whole sort of like the click and tap of the typewriter and things like that as well. It's like it almost comes across to me like a resistance fighter. Somebody like that. That's very much what it gives it to me. Like like almost like a guerrilla sort of clandestine sort of appearance, if you know what I mean. And
Absolutely.
it's basically because it's now pretty much in the public eye and almost in public domain and being classed as almost like a criminal activity now. That's essentially to me what it means, that we're going to take this, we're going to take it underground to stop it from falling into the wrong hand.
So then the next track is Break and Enter, and we hear a bunch of smashing glass here. There's a familiar style sort of rave riff, which by this point we've become accustomed to with the style of music. It's a long track, which again for me ties into the fact that probably, a 3-minute 30 song is not going to work for this kind of music. You need the length to really get into the beat, particularly if you are, rolling on something. You're going to need that length of time to enjoy the track. What are your feelings about Break and Enter?
Equally, you're saying about the length, first of all, I mean, this is in a time as well, these songs, a lot of this sort of music was obviously built for that sort of rave culture, and a lot of the time it would have been sort of around the time when DJs would have been using these as well and actually mixing the tracks between the two as well. So with a lot of the time, I always think anyway that these sort of like 7, 8, 9 minute long tracks, it's basically for the purpose it gives a nice period, if you know what I mean. If you're trying to cue two records up at the same time and being able to mix those in, sometimes a 3.5, 4 minute tune isn't going to be able to do that for you. Do you know what I mean? For you to be able to cue that up, bring it in and actually make those beats one before you transfer it over.
Absolutely, and that's why we have you here today, to try and shed some light on some of what is appearing to me as something external and alien to a degree. Prodigy were always there. I didn't dismiss them. It was just I was more on the sort of happy house tip. More of the sort of sophisticated like club diva thing is gonna float my boat more than this would have at the time. Obviously, time's gone on.
Yes,
and we go to Their Law, which is Fuck 'em and Their Law, rock and rave. It's a long track. Pop will eat itself, and I can totally hear the rebellion here and why it would have appealed to the rave culture and actually people at large. I think will probably still like to hear this song in this day and age with the election just happening, today.
Yeah, exactly.
Fuck 'em and Their Law is probably still just as relevant today. So I think this is a very strong track. And what are your feelings on it?
I think it's very strong, as you say, very strong. It's a very important piece of work as well. If I know it's not. I know Liam actually said at some point that the album wasn't supposed to be aimed, I believe anyway, with regards to that as a response to the criminalization of the rave scene back then. But it just seems almost like a little bit too coincidental to have a track that actually uses such a powerful line as "fuck 'em and their law" as well. It really does sort of put it on there. It's for me as well. Even now, I'll be honest. I have that track on my iPod. I do. I listen to that. It's a great motivating tune. It's a great piece of gym music as well. It's got that real
for lifting. Yeah, I can imagine it'll get you really fired up.
For running, it puts hype into you. It really does. It's I just love the whole thing as well. The fact that it has. I'm also a fan of sort of like rock and metal as well to a certain extent, and the fact that it manages to really successfully bring those two together.
I agree.
As well. It brings them together.
I think
really
it's a good fusion. I obviously my first time hearing it, so you've lived with it for all these years, so it's a real classic for you. And,
it is.
And
it
something.
Is. Yeah, I'd probably go as far to say that it's one. It's not but for me, if I had to do like a top 10 of Prodigy tunes that they've done throughout time, this would certainly make the top 10 for me.
Excellent,
no doubt.
Next up we have Full Throttle, and as you'd expect, the tempo goes up considerably. Again, heart rate is, the sky's the limit with heart rate, and the beat definitely reflects that here. You've got a rave piano hook, there's sort of that sort of splodgy kind of sound that you associate with rave as well here. It goes up like big time here, and you are like, it's a big time sort of dance track. You can just imagine this. Full Throttle is, in the middle of the party when you're going at it, hammer and tongs. How do you feel about this song?
It's very much from the first album, from the Prodigy experience, the first one they did, it had a very, I'd say almost Americanized, sort of like polished, sort of acidy house sort of sound to it. This sort of album, and maybe some of the tracks that sort of earlier on in this album as well. It's where you first get what became sort of for me like that very unmistakable Prodigy sound. That as much as maybe to someone like yourself who's not necessarily that much into this sort of music, into the rave music and the rave scene and culture, that it can sound repetitive to some people. But to somebody like myself who's been, you know, as you said, like later in sort of like the late 90s, early noughties, was going to raves on a regular basis, and you could always, with that sort of sound that's embodied within Full Throttle, it's very much a typical Prodigy sound.
Yeah.
And it's a changeover as well. It's from the first album going away from that more polished sort of sound. This comes away almost from, as I say, that sort of influence to making their own sound as well. It's very gritty. It's almost, I'd almost go as far to say that it's almost got like an aggressive sort of feel to it as well.
Yeah.
It's got a gritty, aggressive sort of almost like a dirty, grimy sort of feel to it, which, considering if what this album is meant to sort of represent, it's ideal.
Yeah. We go on to Voodoo People, which is the first single on the track listing. Number 1 in Finland, number 7 in Ireland, number 13 in the UK. What I've got here is that the beats are powerful and energized. It totally belongs in a club with sweaty, wide-eyed, loved-up ravers off their tits on ecstasy, waving around glow sticks with a bottle of Poland Spring aglow with condensation. Voodoo people, shaman people, or whatever it is that they say. You know, I get it. It's not, you know, it's just, I get it. It's in its pocket. I feel detached from this. And I completely get that there's a generation, a jilted generation of people that are going to be into this song. What are your thoughts on Voodoo People?
I like it. It's a great song. It's a great song. It's got again, same as we were sort of saying with Full Throttle, with you know the other tracks on there. It's very much, it's unmistakable Prodigy again. I really like the way the song's put together, and for me personally, this version thereof I'd always been quite fond of as well. But again, the Pendulum, they actually did a remix of this as well a few years after. Their remix of Voodoo People again was tremendous. It really was. It was a great piece of work. Pendulum, that also part of what's known as Knife Party as well. They've done all that, but
which I know nothing about. So you know, talk to us about this. What is Knife Party? What is
Knife Party? Well, originally Pendulum are basically, from what I believe they're from the Netherlands, and they've had a couple of albums that have been around that are predominantly sort of drum and bass music around that sort of thing, which obviously when this sort of album came around was very much in its infancy, to be honest. It was a concept rather than actually a reality.
Almost
at that
driven
point.
By this.
Definitely. Yeah. You know, you can really see with all the different genres of sort of rave going in from sort of like techno even to house music, what then became things like happy hardcore and drum and bass and things like that as well. They all very much complement each other, and it's very much, it progresses on from there. It really does. But Pendulum themselves had a few. I think they had maybe one or two that really sort of made it in the charts. One of them was called Slam, which was probably the biggest one from someone who's more geared on sort of like, I suppose, the mainstream sort of side of music. Slam would probably be the only one that you would have ever heard of.
Right.
Yeah. And then later on went on to do, I believe it's one or two of a couple of their members went on to do another side project which was known as Knife Party. And as I say, they've done quite a few.
And I want to get back to more sort of ideas of, you know, how alive this kind of music still is, and if there is still a legion of people, an allegiance to this kind of music, and it's, you know, we'll touch on that.
Yeah, sure.
Speedway is the theme from Fastlane. This makes you feel like you're in a stolen car in the motorway with the police chasing you. Apparently, this track sampled Chaotic Chemistry's Illegal Subs. Illegal Subs sampled Ghetto Heaven, so we have lineage here with the samples. I'm seeing that this now, this is part of what's going on here, is recognizing parts of music from other parts of music, and it goes back and back, because I'm pretty sure that Ghetto Heaven samples a bunch of stuff as well. What else do we have here? This track goes in a completely different direction. This track goes in a completely different direction at about 6 minutes and 30 seconds, and that change that it does at 6:30, suddenly I'm in heaven. I love where it goes with this swimmy synth hook. It's definitely my favourite part of the whole album on Speedway. Theme from Fastlane.
Oh, okay. Speedway for me, I like the beats that hit you a little harder. You know, I mean, the sort of things that you were talking about, things like Voodoo People, like their law. they're more my type of music.
Right.
It very much.
Then why do you think this song was on the album? Do you not feel it has a place? Why was it there for you?
Why was it there? Because it's at the same time, it's as much as we were saying, you know, some people believe that type of music is very sort of mono sort of beat. It doesn't really have any sort of particular sound. Do you get what I mean? It's almost like a repetitive beat sort of thing going on from it. But there are very much different types of the actual tracks that actually come along with it. Speedway isn't really, I'd say, the sort of thing that I'm into would be, as I say, with something like their Law, Voodoo People, it builds you up to a certain point, and then you'll get it up to almost that sort of, you could use the sort of term like a euphoric sort of point where you're almost waiting for the tune to sort of, the song just to explode into something.
The dance orgasm.
If you like, yeah. But whereas Speedway for that never really happens.
Right.
That never really happens with Speedway.
The heat, the energy is our next track. Another mind-bending, energetic romp. Seems much more for dancing than listening. Almost like, from what you're saying, that they're compensating on the lack of oomph in Speedway, and then they give it to you back on the heat, the energy.
Agreed, definitely. I mean, I think it's around a 2-minute mark. This really sort of, it takes its time to build it into the actual track itself, but then at around that 2-minute mark, it really uses like a really hype sort of techno beat, and it really sort of gives it to you literally full throttle, which is, yeah.
Exactly, which is another title on the album. So, you know, they know their audience, don't they?
Oh, definitely, yeah. They definitely know it. I mean, it's, yeah, they really do.
Poison. The phone rings. Someone answers and says, "Liam, the phone's for you," to which he replies, "For fuck's sake, I'm trying to write this fucking tune, man." Pace-wise, this is much slower than the rest of the album, you know, much more of a slower groove. And Poison is a #1 in Finland. Now, Finland are huge fans of the Prodigy, and I like Finland because they listen to my music as well. So, where else have we got here? Oh, #3 in Ireland. #5 in Norway, so this is a big hit. Yeah, I don't really have much else to say. I found the image, I like the image here. You've got like some, you know, some rat bait or something on the cover of the sleeve and like some dusty old bottles in the background. I like their imagery as well. I think some of their imagery is really interesting. They're not really focused on the typical things that go with, you know, rock and pop sensibility of marketing the actual artist. That's not what it's about, which says to me it's about the music. Talk to us about Poison.
Poison, another one of my favourites, definitely. Yeah, Poison. This, I mean, as this album, as we're going through it as well, anybody who's a fan of the Prodigy and their sort of music, I think will agree that literally, you know, these are some of their bigger and better sort of tracks that they've ever done. I mean, they are an absolute powerhouse when it comes to this sort of music.
Yeah.
I mean, even today, they're still sort of, you know, they're still turning out really great music at this point. But Poison in particular, I definitely would say it's one of my favourites as well.
What do you think Poison's referring to?
It could be. It's really down to interpretation of the individual, really. Poison itself, because it refers to poison and remedy. You know, I've got the poison, I've got the remedy. It could be the pitfalls and the dangers of sort of taking ecstasy and things like that as well. You know, from the drug sort of perspective, I wouldn't have obviously understood that when this first came out. When this first came out, being 13 as I was then, it just sounded great to me. It really did, for being into that sort of music, the sound of it. But the whole poison and the remedy thing, I think it's like the potential double-edged sword of sort of like taking ecstasy back then. You know, it could end up being a poison that eventually, in, you know, around this sort of time, I do believe quite a few ravers.
Well, yeah, they were. There were people that were, you know, dying from it, as there are from, you know, from any sort of narcotic use. It does, you know, heroin or whatever.
But essentially, it's what one side is for me. It could be one side is the poison itself. In other words, something that can really take you down down a bad path, not necessarily to always death and things like that, but even to a point that they would even say that when some people are taking these sort of things, you can have like a really decent time where you can literally find yourself elevated to this sort of euphoric state, and there can be other times literally where it just completely throws your mind in a completely different direction. And I can remember,
bad trip, almost.
A bad trip, definitely. Yeah.
So, No Good, Start the Dance is the next single on the album. It's obviously a big hit here. Again, #1 in Finland. You know, Finland clearly love this band. #2 in Holland. #4 in UK, Ireland, in Germany. A top 10 in Austria. Belgium, Norway, and Switzerland. So, a pan-European smash. Awesome. Obviously a big hit single. Sped up female background vocals, impossibly fast breakbeats, a sadness to the chords and sentiment here. Dance the pain away with this song, which I largely ignored when it was a hit. Listening to it on the Coach USA yesterday on the way up to Woodbury Commons, I found a new sort of sadness to it, which I hadn't heard before, and just sort of a resolve to it. I think it had much more power than I ever gave it credit for. What are your feelings on the song?
We're talking about the top 10 of tracks, that is number one for me. No Good Start the Dance, awesome piece of work. Just the whole way that the song itself is constructed as well. It really has sort of like, it has quite a long sort of intro before it really gets to what I would call the meat of the song itself. But at the same time, a lot of the time with sort of rave music, and even some of the Prodigy's own stuff, by the time it actually leads you to that point where when you're actually dancing to the music or getting into it where you really want to be, it kind of sometimes leaves you wanting, leaves you waiting. But this doesn't for me. This song literally, from the first beat, it's there. Do you know what I mean? It takes you right the way up to where you need to be, and then it's an awesome, really great sounding song. Really.
So just to give the audience some perspective, now you've said as far as the Prodigy's discography goes, this registers as your number one song. Definitely. Where did the Prodigy sit in your musical taste overall?
Wow. That's a big question. I mean, I'd say I've got quite an eclectic taste when it comes to music. I really have. I have sort of quite a lot of musical influences, but certainly as a teenager going through those, or just becoming like an early teen into sort of like my later years, definitely they're massively influential in sort of what my music taste is today. I started off with things like the Prodigy, that then led you on to sort of that led me on to other artists that were sort of into sort of the realms of happy hardcore music, that then sort of led into the development and the progression of drum and bass, even to the point that their sort of music probably started me on the path. And I'd say even today I'm still I don't really go to raves and things like that anymore because the scene itself isn't as big as what it used to be, and I'm not 18, 19 years old anymore, really. But massive, like one of the
that's a forming of your musical taste, you could say.
Forming of that side of my musical taste, definitely.
Right, yeah.
They're a massive influence in that.
And I just say that, just so we have a sort of an idea of where this album, obviously you chose the album for the show, and I'm really glad that you did. One Love is the next single. It was the first single from the album. It was top 10 in 1993. It actually, just in the UK, this was a top 10, reaching number 7. Tribal vibe vocally with this, which I liked. I like this. In the swing of the album, I'm enjoying these tracks. And I also like how now that you are starting, on the second and third listen now, the penny's dropping. And obviously, the longer I do this album review show, the longer I realize that you've really got to give this material a chance to reach you. And I'd say that the Prodigy's breakdowns are a welcome signature of their unique style.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Where does One Love sit with you?
One Love it's a there or thereabouts for me. Would I call it a good song? Definitely I would. I would say that. Does it really punch weight with some of their other work? Not really, not for me.
Right.
But then, as I say, I do get your tribal reference because essentially, Voodoo People. Even if you're going back to that sort of track, it's a tribal reference in the same sort of way. Are they talking? Is it a reference in the form of that, like who the ravers were, the community of ravers in that way? Are they like a tribe within their own selves? And obviously, it's got that tribal sound of being called One Love as well. Is it like their own sort of group, tribe, community thing within the ravers back at that point?
Yeah. So we go on to this, what I call the Narcotic Suite, which are these last 3 tracks, and a clear reference to what we're talking about on the album here. We're talking about drugs.
Sure.
3 Kilos starts out the trio of tracks that we have here. This song would be perfect for a computer game. It has a kind of chilled swagger to it. I enjoy the diversity of this track. The flute is an unexpected flourish, and it has humor to it. I think this song has a great deal of humor, and what is probably my favorite track on the album. Speedway's a close second. It's essentially an instrumental and increases my respect for the band substantially. I was sat on the bus to, like I said, to Woodbury Common and enjoyed this track as it sort of hurtled through industrial New Jersey. I thought this was just like, I felt like I was on a mission with them, and it was kind of, there was definitely a humor to it with the 3 Kilos. What are your feelings?
3 Kilos, this to me, the album's reached its peak at this point for me. It's a great album, as I said. It's one of if not the best album for me that they've done. Period. But this is the whole Narcotic Suite doesn't really speak to me on any great volume. It has got, it's got like a real funky sound to it as well. It's almost, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like the best way to describe it. Literally, it's almost got like it could almost be like a theme tune for Shaft, you know, that sort of thing. It's got that real sort of good vibe to it. But it has got, I think you can just imagine with this, you know, like
it does feel like it's coming from a different direction. It's almost as though these songs were recorded during a sort of a different period of time. Would you?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that, definitely. Yeah, it's got a... Yeah, I haven't really add anything to that.
No, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely. Skylined, the Narcotic Suite. Again, this is the second track. I like the steering chords here as they remind me of OMD and Gary Newman. I think it's quite possible that, you know, just like our cousin Trevor, who loved rave music and loved OMD and Gary Newman, that they probably had their hearts set on some of the early electronic sound as well. Mm-hmm. And what I like about this track is it finishes with the sea washing up on shore, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, Skyline is, again, you know, hence why it's in the Narcotic Suite as well. Skyline is like literally, you know, like in the same way it could be used in the same context of Full Throttle, couldn't it?
Right.
You know, from a Jack perspective, Skyline is literally, if you're taking any sort of psychedelic sort of, you know, ecstasy, any of the other sort of drugs that are around at that time, it's like literally, it's up there sort of, as they would have said back in those days, off you pickle.
Claustrophobic Sting, Narcotic Suite, the last of the 3, and I think, you know, you've made it clear that the meat and potatoes of the album's happened for you already.
Sure, definitely.
There's a synthesized laugh here, isn't there? There's a synthesized seagulls, is it, or a baby crying? I can't quite tell if it's...
I couldn't tell you exactly.
This is much more in keeping with what I would expect from the Prodigy. My mind is glowing. You know, very like... Exactly, it ties into rave culture perfectly. It's like that my mind is glowing is exactly what the audience wants to hear. I can't be mad at this return to form because they have most definitely taken me on a journey. And no, I didn't take anything. This was just, you know, me actually listening to it. Do you have anything to add for the Claustrophobic Sting?
I think just from listening to this, and obviously with its title, it's again, it's embodied, and it's a reference to obviously taking things like ecstasy and things like that from. Occasionally, it can have the feeling of becoming claustrophobic. You know, actually, like when people are on these sort of things, like the world is pretty much closing in on you when it gets to that sort of point. And yeah, I think that's pretty much just a direct reference to that. The different sort of experiences that people can have on those sort of drugs.
Right.
Really, that's my thoughts.
Closing thoughts on the album for me then are, I had 3-4 listens to the album. Again, this was a recommendation from my brother Alex, who's very kindly appeared on the show from London with us. And I would be happy to hear it again, I really would. I think when Prodigy were doing the business in the 90s, as I've said, I was much more of a happy house head. Remixes of the Divas were regulars on my turntable. I was always fairly neutral about the band. On hearing their work today, I am more impressed by their work than I expected to be. If you're not on drugs, I think the connection to this music is an entirely different animal. Outside of the dance floor, the work is at times cerebrally transportive, and one can't help but wonder if Liam was off his nut when he made this music. You do feel as though you've been on a bunch of mental roller coasters, and that feeling, coupled with the undeniable dance potential of the music, leads me to a final score of 76%. But of course, in this case, my final score's not the only thing to take into account. Alex, do you have any closing things to say about this album and your final score?
For me, as I said, with this album itself, I think is from the perspective of someone who's been into rave music, who's, you know, obviously for me it was a bit later on. I wasn't really getting into sort of, I wasn't old enough to be getting into raves until like the late 90s, early noughties and things like that. And I took my first opportunities then to go to raves like sort of World Dance, One Nation, all of those sort of things back in those times. This, from a perspective of someone who's been into that sort of music, this is a very important piece of work. Very, very important piece of work. It's it's a foundation, it's a building block of what the rest of those music genres sort of grew to become and things like that. So I personally think, obviously I've got to take in the fact that it's not your own sort of personal preference and your choice of music. For me, that's massively underselling at 76, personally.
Right, so what's your mark?
I'd say 92.
92?
92%.
Which gives us a total of mark of 168, which we divide by 2, which leaves the Prodigy with an 84% running commentary albums review final mark.